So the brain in one way is designed to help us develop rituals, and the downside of that is that actually we can become very rigid, and
right.
if we tune out what we can become a bit rigid, and that's why SWITCHCRAFT and agility is so important.
Do you think our brains are keeping up with the technology?
Actually, what we're doing is we're switching very rapidly from one thing to the other. So we're looking at one thing, so we might think we're actually thinking about lots of things at the same time, but we're not. We're actually thinking about one and then the other and switching very rapidly between them. But the problem with that is it's very draining of energy for the brain. It takes up a lot of energy.
Hi everyone, welcome to Pivot Global. Today's guest, we are having Professor Elaine Fox, the author of SWITCHCRAFT, How Agile Thinking Can Help You Adapt and Thrive. And welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be on.
Yes. So, Professor, you're a professor and head of the School of Psychology at the University of Adelaide, Australia. And prior to moving to Australia, you spent almost 10 years at the University of Oxford. And you founded an institution called Ocean. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, it was a centre for emotion and affective science at the University of Oxford. So I was there for about 12 years probably before I moved to Australia.
Great. So today I'd like to kind of a deep dive on your book SWITCHCRAFT. At the same time, I'd like to learn about real world practices and daily life practices, so our audience can after they see this video they can use it in real life. So I'm gonna start by asking about. The story about the robber you saw in the newspaper was a very kind of interesting, funny story that, there was a robber, they tried to steal something, and one of the robber was a bus driver. So they tried to escape by riding a bus, and the bus driver followed the same routine,
Absolutely. So I read it on the Underground in London, in the newspaper you get on the Underground, and I thought it was a really funny story. And it said that there were the three guys who basically robbed a shop store, and they had their getaway vehicle was a bus, because one of the robbers was actually a bus driver, and they clearly weren't that experienced. They weren't very good at what they were trying to do, because the police were alerted pretty quickly and started following them in the getaway bus. And what they realized very quickly is that they weren't actually taking the most obvious route to get away. They were actually following the normal bus route. So it was actually really funny. So the guy, and of course, it kind of reflects what we know about psychology in general, that particularly when we're under pressure and when we're under a lot of stress, we tend to revert to the familiar. We tend to revert to what we know because it's kind of comforting. So that bus driver, he's obviously under a lot of stress, and he just literally went his normal route, even though that wasn't a very sensible thing to do, and he was caught and apprehended very quickly. But I think it's a funny story, but it kind of reflects an important psychological principle. I think that when we're under pressure, we're much more likely to stick with what's worked before. And the important message I give in SWITCHCRAFT is that that's not necessarily the best solution. It may not be the best thing to do in that situation. So we need to always be very alert to what's going on around us and really try and think on our feet a little bit and figure out what's the best thing to do. And that's particularly important. I know a lot of your audience are entrepreneurs and developing startups. And of course, in that kind of world, that's particularly important to really, rather than thinking, well, this has worked in the past, so the same thing will work again, you're really thinking very carefully, well, is this actually the best way forward, or should we be thinking about some different way of doing things?
So it's a funny story, but at the same time, it scares me. So my question is that why does our brain or psychology work that way? Because is it more efficient that when we are in an emergency or when we want to make right decisions, why does the brain work that way?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And we're still learning a lot about the brain and how it works, of course. And it's interesting because our brain is actually designed to be agile. So right from the beginning, that's how our brain evolved, and to allow us to be very flexible in doing different things. But at the same time, the brain loves familiarity. And it's partly to do with some of the mechanics, if you like, or the biochemistry of how the brain works. Because anytime we kind of have to really process information in a deep way, that burns energy. It burns up chemicals. It burns up energy in the brain. Whereas if we do things that are very familiar to us, it doesn't really burn up energy. So the brain, it's quite relaxing for the brain, which is why habits can be quite good and why rituals can be quite good, because we don't need to think too much about it. But of course, the downside of that is particularly when we're in a crisis situation and we, more than ever, we need to be thinking on our feet. The problem is the brain also wants to conserve energy. So the problem is that the brain doesn't really want to try out new things because actually that's going to burn a lot of energy. So we tend to revert to, the familiar and what's worked in the past, which, as we were saying, is not necessarily the best solution in whatever situation you might be in.
That, again, that puzzles me because if the brain was very efficient and very logical, wouldn't it work in a different way? Because if you're in a danger or you have to escape from something, why doesn't the brain tell us to work in a different way or not follow the routine? Or are we not using the bell in the right way?
Well, I think it's very interesting. It's kind of a good system. It's a kind of system that's developed for endless number of different possibilities. That's the problem. So dangers come in very different ways. So I guess if we think right back to our early ancestors in, say, evolutionary time, the main threats they had would be, animals, wild animals, and that kind of thing. Nowadays, the kind of threats we have is often fear of unemployment or fear of a business not working out. They're quite different type of things. But we've also learned a lot in recent times about how the brain actually works, and it's really changed a lot since I was first studying neuroscience. We always had the idea that the brain works by reacting to things that happen in the world. So something happens and we react to that in some way. Now we know that the brain works in almost the opposite way. So the way it works is we predict what's likely to happen next. And then if that happens, everything is fine and we just keep going. If something different happens that we didn't predict, that sends an error signal in the brain to tell us that actually something has changed. So something very sudden happens. We've already predicted that won't happen, and then it does happen. So we get this kind of error signal. But if we think about it, that means that takes up quite a lot of energy in a sense, because we're constantly predicting all the time, and that's how the brain kind of works. And that's why the brain works very much on what I call big data. So the brain has remembered every single thing from the moment you were born. In fact, probably before you were born. So when you were in the womb, the brain remembers all the sights and sounds and feelings you had at those different times. Now, we can't possibly consciously remember all those things, but the brain at some level remembers all of those. So I have one section in SWITCHCRAFT talking about intuition and how important sometimes intuition can be in particularly in business decisions. It's very important. And I don't think there's anything magical about intuition. I think it's very much based on science, and it's because of this way the brain works using big data. So, for example, let's just imagine you were stung by a bee when you were 4 years old or something, and you might have been out somewhere. There were certain smells around, there were certain sounds, there was a certain type of light. Your brain will remember that. You remember with that combination of things, suddenly something unpleasant happened. Now, you won't consciously remember that, but the brain has kind of combined those things in a big data kind of sense. And so what happens is if you happen to be in a similar situation where, there's the same kind of light, there's the same kind of smells, maybe the same kind of feeling, you might suddenly start feeling a bit apprehensive, and you don't really understand why you're feeling a bit fearful or apprehensive. But that's because your brain is kind of giving you a hint. And that's kind of how intuition works, I think. It's giving you a little push that actually in this situation before something nasty happened. So that's why I think, and I have a section, SWITCHCRAFT, particularly relating to business, where, I think it's very important to listen to our intuitions in a way, because it's actually, I think, our brain giving us information. So it doesn't give us enough information to really make a decision on its own. We still need the rational, the facts and the figures and everything. But I think in combination and listening to those intuitive thoughts can be really powerful. And I think the really top business leaders are kind of aware of this, and they will. And I think we've all had that situation. You might be thinking about, say, developing a new product or doing a new thing. And all the facts and figures might say we should definitely do this. But actually, you just have a gut feeling that, no, that may not be quite the right thing. And I think it's really important to listen to those kind of gut feelings, because often they are quite accurate. They're kind of giving you a hint about something.
However, compared to like hundreds of years ago, 1,000 years ago, now we're filled with information, lots of technology, the change is so fast. Do you think our brains are keeping up with the technology? Because, compared, maybe we're like a computer full of storage, we have full of information, and maybe there's a bug in our institution. Do you think the brain or our psychological self is keeping up with the quick and the rapid technology change?
Yes. Yeah, again, it's a very interesting question. And I think one thing that's kind of happened now is that we've started outsourcing, if you like, a lot of our memories. So, you know, if you think because it's just so much information, we can't possibly take it all in. So we'll on the simplest level, we'll take down notes, we'll put things on our mobile phone, you know, we'll kind of outsource things, or we'll set reminders to help us to do things. Whereas I think at one stage we would have all done that ourselves, just using our own brain. So if you knew you had 3 or 4 tasks to do in a day, you would have to remember that, and you wouldn't have an automatic prompt. So I think we've kind of adapted to that sense in that we are, you know, outsourcing, if you like, a lot of those things, and we have prompts to remind us to do things, and that can be very helpful. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. It can really help us be much more organized. So we're kind of using the technology in a very good way to really kind of help us rather than to go against us in a sense.
So do you think there are limits to our storage, or do you think we're kind of infinite if we outsource our information?
Well, it depends what level you're talking about. So I think it's definitely infinite when we're talking about, like when we were talking about this intuition and what the brain processes. The brain has a huge capacity for that. So it will literally remember all of these things. But we do have a very limited capacity in terms of what we can consciously remember. You know, so there's only so much you can keep in your mind at a conscious kind of level. So it's kind of, so on the one hand, you know, we can take in a lot of information at a very low level, and the brain, at some kind of sense, remembers that. But in terms of what we can consciously remember or keep in our mind at one time, there is definitely a limit. And in fact, I did a lot of research in the past on attention and looking at and memory, and looking at, you know, how much bits of information can we keep in our mind at any one time. And the typical thing is about 3 to 4 different bits of information. So if you think of, say, an entrepreneur or people in business, or, you know, in any different occupation where there's multiple things going on, that's actually really, really difficult. And I think one of the things I talk about in SWITCHCRAFT is that it's this idea of multitasking is very much a myth. You know, we often think we can multitask. Actually, what we're doing is we're switching very rapidly from one thing to the other. So we're looking at one thing. So we might think we're actually thinking about lots of things at the same time, but we're not. We're actually thinking about one and then the other and switching very rapidly between them. And we can get quite good at that. But the problem with that is it's very draining of energy for the brain. It takes up a lot of energy. And so if we keep doing that and don't take kind of breaks, or don't have gaps in between things, we will burn out very quickly. We'll really lose our energy very, very quickly.
You talked about using a timer, and it's important to, when you start something, you have to end something. Could you walk us through, you know, practical tips how you can use a timer to multitask?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, so on the one hand, I've kind of argued in the book that your multitasking generally isn't a very good thing. And if we're doing multiple things in a day, it's very important to keep a gap between them. So even if it's only just get up and have a cup of coffee or have a quick walk around, you know, just having, like, once you finish one thing, have a little gap before you start the new thing. And a lot of us, when we're very busy and we have multiple projects, we jump from one thing to the other, and we just don't give ourselves enough time between them. So that's definitely the case. The brain, you know, needs a bit of time, even if it's only a few minutes, you know, between them. But at the same time, we can use that multitasking as a kind of a training method. And I give lots of tips in the books about how we can do this. So as you're mentioning, the idea with the timer is to pick maybe 3 or 4 tasks that you think might take you, you know, not too long a time. So maybe you have to compose an email to somebody, you have to write a letter, you have to, you know, maybe do something. Take things that will take a reasonable amount of time and set the timer to go off. If you think, okay, I'm going to work on this for, say, 4 minutes or 5 minutes, and then I'll move to the next task. The key is you set the timer to go off every, say, 4 or 5 minutes. And the key is you start doing one task, and as soon as that timer goes off, you instantly switch to the next task, and then keep doing that, even if you're not finished the first one, and then keep doing that. Now, normally, that's not a good idea. In the normal workday, you shouldn't do that. But as a training exercise, it's a very good way of helping you to learn how to switch your mind very quickly from one thing to the other. And if you do that on a regular basis, and we've done some studies in our lab group when I was back in Oxford, and we found that actually it really helps people to get much better at kind of that multitasking and switching their mindset very quickly from one thing to the other. Because that is difficult. It's difficult to switch from one thing to the other. But that's one way of kind of helping that. But you shouldn't do it all the time because it is very draining of energy. So.
Do you use that technique in your daily life, like switching from task to task using a timer?
Yes, I have sometimes. I mean, as a kind of a training exercise, I've certainly, usually what I try to do when I set up experiments where I'm testing other people, I usually try and do it myself as well to make sure I really understand what it's really like. So certainly when we were doing those studies in Oxford, I certainly did do that myself. And it is actually quite effective. You do get much quicker. Because I think what's difficult, I don't know if you find the same, but I often find that if I'm trying to finish something and I know I've kind of run out of time and I need to move on to something else, I find it very hard somehow to finish some things.
Right.
I think, okay, I'll spend another 5 minutes. I'll just try and get this finished before I move on. So I think that's what it helps you do. It helps you actually say, okay, I'm just going to leave that. I can come back to it later, but I'm now going to move on to the next thing. And it does definitely help with that, I think.
And interesting that you come back to that task. So for instance, if you say like 3 minutes for writing an email, you cannot finish it, you move on to the next task, say like booking a restaurant, having some chores, and you come back to the task of writing an email. That's an interesting cycle. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So you can do that. So you can do it in different ways. I mean, you can have lots of different tasks, but I think you also need to get things finished. So the best training is to kind of come back to the original one so that you can then, you can get it finished. And that's quite good in the training exercise as well, because it means that it's not that you've left something unfinished. You will have a chance to get back to it. And the key thing you're learning is just switching very rapidly from one thing to the other.
So let's go back to the point you made about the brain will remember everything, because that kind of reminded me of ChatGPT. And also when I was reading SWITCHCRAFT, I was wondering what's the difference between ChatGPT and our human brain. So do you think there's a difference, or are there like quite a bit similarities between the two?
I think they're quite different in that the capacity of ChatGPT is huge, at a conscious level. So it can draw up, or even like a Google search, can draw up information really rapidly. Now we can't do that. If I ask you to name all the world's capitals very quickly, it's you might do a good job, but actually, whereas
maybe 10, yeah.
But ChatGPT will do that very quickly and very rapidly. So I think the kind of information that our brain remembers at this very large level is much more I'm not sure how to explain it, but much less fine-grained, if you like. So it's not at a conscious level. So it just gives us gives us hints about, was this a good thing, was this a good situation, or was it a bad situation? Which is why we can never rely on our intuition on its own. On its own, it won't allow us to really make big decisions. To make really big decisions, we need both. We need the facts and the rational stuff, and the facts and the figures and all the rest of it that's there at a conscious level. But I think it's also worth tuning in to that kind of unconscious level, if you like, to get a kind of sense, does this feel right or does not feel right? Because often that's telling us something real that, from our past experience. So I think it's often, and particularly with business leaders, I've done a few workshops with business leaders, and they say, when you have management meetings and some people on the team are saying, I just get the sense it's not really the right thing to do, even though it looks like it might be. And I think just listening to those and really trying to say, okay, maybe that's telling us something is often really important, but it's not enough on its own. So, which is why things like AI systems, they're doing things, they have it's a huge, what we call in psychology, working memory capacity. So the number of things you can hold in your head at one time, whereas, as I said, we can only hold about 3 or 4 things at any given time, really. But there's a lot of information underneath that. But that's where AI and those kind of systems, they actually hold a lot of things in conscious memory. So it's a very different system, I think.
Yeah, so I think that point is very relevant to especially our audience, because there are a lot of business leaders, and let's say he or she is in a meeting room and they have to make a decision. And at modern times, there are a lot of data pouring in. You have a data scientist, you have a CTO, you have big data, you have ChatGPT. Yes. But at the last minute, maybe a CEO or a business leader will say, this doesn't feel right, or this doesn't feel good, or this seems right to me when I listen to my gut. Do you think that is like the most important thing? And do you think that can be trained and that can be, exercise, and that can be built into CEOs' brains.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is. I'm not sure I'd say it's the most important thing, but it's definitely really important to listen to. And I do have, I think, a couple of chapters in SWITCHCRAFT about intuition and self-awareness, and how that there are ways we can develop a deeper understanding of ourselves, because that's, the more we understand ourselves, the more we'll understand the world around us, I think, and other people. So I think being aware of those kind of feelings, particularly when they're quite strong, and taking them into account is often quite wise, because I think, as I said, it's coming from this big data that our brain has kind of recognized, and again, that's where it is a little bit similar to ChatGPT, I think, where like often when you look at big data, you find correlations that we would never actually consciously be aware of. We do that with all sorts of data, and so the brain, that's kind of how the brain is operating, in a sense. It's coming up with connections between things from our past experience. And so I think, even though it may not be the most important thing in terms of making a decision, the data might be more important in some situations, but I think in combination, that's the most important thing, making sure we take in the rational information, so we have enough rational information, data, to tell us what the best thing to do is. But we also just need to tune in a bit more to that, whereas a lot of people, I think, suppress that and say, oh, it's not meaningful. Whereas I think at SWITCHCRAFT, what I'm saying is actually it's not something magical. It is something coming from your brain's learning and your brain's experience and your own experience, which is another reason why in the book I argue that it's very important to try and have as diverse a range of experience as possible, because the more diversity you have, the more experience you have, the more likely it is that you'll have come across something similar before, and your brain will have remembered that.
Yeah, so you mentioned that it's important to travel.
Absolutely, exactly. Travel, and there's a lot of psychological research about that the more you travel and you see different cultures, you see different people do things, you just kind of learn that actually there is more than one way to do things, and maybe the way I've been doing it isn't necessarily the best way. Maybe there's a different way of doing it. So I think it helps you to literally be more open-minded and be more curious about how things might work. And of course, that's really important in business, just being very open-minded and open to different ways of doing things, I think. And the companies that are very successful, I think, are probably those that are much more agile and able to kind of change very quickly if new things come along, and if the world kind of changes in a way, as it is constantly. The world is constantly changing with AI and with all the new things happening. The companies that can really change quickly are likely to be much more successful, I think.
So how can a business leader tell that your instinct or your gut feeling is right or wrong? Because let's say the business leader, travels a lot. They go onto social media and try to look for different opinions that are not yours. And how can they make a decision, the right decision? Because you don't want to be a bus driver that's following the same route, because that bus driver was also following his or her instinct.
Exactly. And I think that's where it's very important. So if I could just explain a little bit about SWITCHCRAFT. So there's 4 what I call pillars of SWITCHCRAFT.
Yes.
So the first pillar, and probably the most important one, is agility. And then, but agility is very important, because in order to deal with change, we need to be agile, as we said. But it's not change for its own sake. So we need to change when it's sensible to do so. So we need to really understand the context and to make the right decision. And so the 3 other pillars that underlie that are emotional awareness, self-awareness, and situational awareness. So to answer kind of your question, I think the situational awareness is really, really important. And that's what often we're not good at. Like the bus driver wasn't very aware of his situation. He just reverted to doing what he was familiar with. But actually in that situation, it wasn't the right thing to do. And there's some tragic examples of that, where when people are in buildings and a fire breaks out, it's very common that people will turn around and try and get out the way they came in, even though that may not be the best exit. There may be a much closer exit where they could get out much more easily. So, that's a sad situation where it goes wrong. So I think in any situation like that, just trying to develop a way of really understanding your situation is really important. So really, really trying to understand what other people are feeling, what other people are doing, what the situation is really like, rather than thinking it's the way I want it to be. So, and I think it's a very common thing for all of us. We often think this is the way I want the world to be. So you kind of think, okay, these people are really supporting me, whereas actually, if you really listen to people or look at the situation, that may not be the case. Maybe people have doubts about something. So I think developing that ability to get a very genuine understanding of the situation will help people make much better decisions. And again, so that's one of the big pillars of SWITCHCRAFT, and there's lots of tips in there about how to develop that. So it's very difficult to say how you can make better decisions, but I think having that deeper level of situational awareness is really important, and having a deep level of self-awareness is really important. And then once you've decided what the right action is, having the flexibility to actually go with that. Because I've come across people who they know what the right thing to do is, but they just can't bring themselves to do it. They just, because it's just too much out of their comfort zone, or they just say, I just can't do that, even though I know it's actually the right thing.
Which is important, listening to your inner self or listening to other people?
I think both. I think understanding yourself and what your own values are, because that ultimately would drive yourself. And in terms of, I think curiosity is really important, because that helps us stay more open-minded. So curiosity is a really important thing. And I think curiosity always starts with ourselves, really, being curious about ourselves and why we do the things we do. Why do we want to do certain things and not other things? So I think the more we're curious about ourselves and the more we understand ourselves, the more likely we are then to kind of understand other people and listen to other people. So I think both are really, really important.
Interesting. So in your book, SWITCHCRAFT, you kind of talked about rituals and routines. So, a lot of business leaders, entrepreneurs, they like routines. Steve Jobs wore the same turtleneck every day. So
yes,
like following a routine, what's the importance of like rituals? And at the same time, what is that different from being agile? Because that two seems, contradict, or two seems different.
Yes. They are a bit different in a way, but I think rituals are really important. They play a really important role. And it relates to the fact that when we talked about, say, outsourcing cognitive tasks we have to do. So what it does is rituals often means we don't have to think too much. So, for example, you say Steve Jobs, if he wore the same clothes every day, he didn't have to think about what he's going to wear. So when he got up in the morning, he didn't have to think, oh, what did I wear today? He just picked whatever was there and he put it on, and that's fine. So again, it's saving energy, because every decision we make costs the brain energy. It actually is costing energy. So anytime we have to think of things from scratch or really think about making a decision, that's going to be burning energy. So rituals can be really good because they allow us to effectively outsource that, I suppose, and just, we don't have to think about it. So say with religious rituals or any other kind of rituals, it's a very habitual thing. We don't have to think too much about it. It's very familiar. And that can be kind of really beneficial to us, because obviously we need to be able to adapt to change and adapt to uncertainty. But of course, we don't want to live like that all the time. We want to try and make the world as safe and as kind of as familiar as possible. And that's very good for us psychologically. So, if you're living in an area, going the same way to work every day is very familiar. You don't need to think about it too much. You go to the same place to buy your coffee and, all of those things. You don't need to be making decisions all the time. Which is why it's often very difficult to get out of that when you need to. So the brain in one way is designed to help us develop rituals, and the downside of that is that actually we can become very rigid, and
right.
if we tune out from what, we can become a bit rigid, and that's why SWITCHCRAFT and agility is so important. But at the same time, the benefits of rituals are it helps us to be much more relaxed and not have to think about everything and not make decisions with every single thing we're doing. There's a lot of things we could just do. We don't have to think too much about.
Do you have a ritual you always follow, or do you have a ritual you have stopped in order to change or be more agile?
Yeah, I think a number of years ago I start a ritual because I realized it was important. So I wanted to do some more exercise to kind of keep fit, and with the very busy job, that's often quite difficult. So often I was missing, going to the gym or going for a run or something, and then I suddenly find like a week or 2 weeks had gone by and I hadn't really done anything. So now what I do is I literally every second day I do some form of exercise. So that's a kind of a rule, and it might be going for a run, it might be going to the gym, and I usually go in the morning before work. But so I think just having having that saying that this is something that I'm just going to do and I don't have to think about it. So I know every second day I'm definitely going to be going to the gym in the morning. So it's kind of a ritual like that. And it means that I don't really need to think about it. And of course, the problem was before when I didn't have that, I was thinking about it. I thought, oh, well, I won't do today, I'll do tomorrow. And then, but tomorrow something else would come up and I get busy and, and then suddenly days and days would go by. So I think having something consistent like that and just sticking to it means you don't have to think about it too much. And then you are actually, you're scheduling time to do your exercise so that it's not something you have to kind of think about too much.
But at the same time, you can't just stick to one ritual. You have to be kind of flexible and agile in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. And obviously, if there are times if it's just not appropriate, some days it might come along and I just, for some reason, or if I'm traveling or something, you actually can't do that. So, of course, you have to maintain that flexibility. But I think when you're in a more settled kind of situation, if you have some of those rituals, then actually that can be really helpful to make sure you keep doing the things you want to do,
Yeah, so I think in your book, SWITCHCRAFT, you keep emphasizing that there's not seen as a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to be, very open to new ideas and very more flexible. Is that the message you want to do? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's probably the biggest message, really, I wanted to convey in the book is I've absolutely found that in my own research. But I think it's true in a lot of areas in psychology and just in everyday life. And I think, there's a lot of really good evidence-based techniques in psychology that we know are really helpful. So we know mindfulness, for example, can be really helpful in certain situations. A growth mindset is really important. There's a lot of evidence for that. Having the positivity ratio of having 3 positive events to every 1 negative event is a good thing for our well-being. But the main reality is that none of those techniques are good for every situation we're going to be faced with. So there really is no one size fits all. And I give the example in the book of like playing golf. So I know golf is quite popular in Japan, I think, but if you go out onto a golf course, you have a number of different golf clubs, and that's because you're faced with different challenges. In, of course, 18 holes of golf, you're faced with quite different challenges. If you only had one club, you'd be very good at one type of shot, but you'd be really poor at all the other shots. And so I've kind of argued that it's a bit the same with life. We need lots of different tactics or different strategies to deal with different situations. So even though there may be things in psychology that are very evidence-based, like say mindfulness, mindfulness isn't good for every situation. It might be good for some situations, but not for every situation. So that's why I think we need to have this diversity and then have the flexibility to pick the right one at the right time.
Interesting. Any other research you found that are interesting you can share with our audience?
In terms of flexibility?
Yes, flexibility, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so I did, before I came to Australia, we had a big longitudinal study, as we call them in psychology, where we followed people over a 5-year period. So these were children, so from the age of about 12 until they were about 16 or 17. So, of course, they're secondary school years, basically teenage years. And we measured a whole range of things. We looked at genetics. We looked at cognitive biases, as I mentioned. We had lots of questionnaire measures. And we were trying to really pick out, what are the things that would lead to more resilience and what are the things that would lead to more anxiety and depression. And one of the things we really found was that improved flexibility was a really important predictor of resilience. So those people who are much more adaptable, who are able to find different ways of solving problems, they were much more likely to be resilient, which is why I think that flows into things like with entrepreneurs and startups, that, if you can find different solutions and be flexible about finding and working your way around different problems, because there'll always be setbacks, there'll always be problems. And we found that the children who are able to do that were much more resilient, whereas the children who are much more anxious tended to be very fixed in their strategies. They would try one thing and they would just do lots of other research around the world, showing that flexibility is so important. And I think particularly when the world is changing so much, I think these abilities, these mental talents, as I call them, of being agile and flexible are more important than ever, probably.
Do you think age matters? Because, Japan is an aging society. I'm not saying the elders are bad, but it seems to me that the younger you are, the more flexible you are.
I think that is true. There is a lot of evidence for that. So I think if you look at young children, like they are completely flexible. They try anything. They don't, it's that they'll just try all sorts of things. And then over the years, we tend to get, and in some ways that's important. We need to establish, okay, what we're good at, what we're not so good at. We'll develop our own abilities. But I think you're right, we do lose that ability to be more flexible as we get older. But again, there's a lot of really interesting research showing that we're never too old to learn how to do things in new ways. So when I was studying neuroscience many years ago now, when I was a student, we were told that after the age of about 7, the brain was more or less set in stone, and you couldn't really change much more after that. But now we know that that's just totally untrue. That there's been studies in Sweden done, for example, with much older people in their 80s, 90s even, where they show there's still a lot of what they call neural regeneration, so that actually different cells, different circuits can develop even when we're much older in life. So I think it does get harder. It gets harder. People get more set in their ways, if you like, as we get older. But I think it's never too late to change. I mean, we can always, but it just takes a bit more effort when you're a bit older.
And there are a lot of tips in your book, SWITCHCRAFT, how to train how to be flexible. And so I'd like to invite our audience to read SWITCHCRAFT. And I especially like the story about the coffee cup. You can use this coffee cup not just to drink coffee, or maybe use it a pen case or pen stand, or to catch a spider.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, exactly. Well, that's one of the things that I can talk about. So simple exercise. It's a typical thing we often do with children. I'm not sure if you do that in Japan, but it's a kind of typical children's game where you'll take an object and say, how many different uses can you think of this object? So like the coffee cup, for example. Yeah. But that's actually a good method, a simple method to try and increase your flexibility. So, normally we think, okay, coffee cup is for drinking coffee. But as you say, it could be used as a pen holder. It could be used to hold the door open. It could be used for a whole variety of things. So constantly kind of thinking of unusual uses for those kind of things. It's actually a test we use in psychology. It's called the unusual uses task. And what you find is that people who can come up with more ways of using a common object like that tend to be much more flexible. They'll be mentally more flexible. And so if you do that on a regular basis with different kinds of objects, that's another way of kind of training your brain to be a bit more flexible and to open your mind to different possibilities.
So, Elaine, we need to wrap up. Are there any other points we haven't discussed, or do you have anything to add and final comments for our audience?
Well, I just hope at the end of the book, in the last chapter, I've given a whole range of kind of tips for living, if you like, which hopefully people will find kind of useful. And I think one of the things I really say is the last one, I think, is like enjoy the journey. So actually just enjoy life, because I think a lot of the time we get very stressed and we get very depressed about setbacks and failures. So I think actually, if we think about our own abilities and the things we've done, generally most people have done really good things and have done also the good things. So sometimes I think we need to be a little bit easier on ourselves, or have a bit of self-compassion, if you like, which I think sometimes we don't always have that. And like I've often talked, when I've kind of worked with different groups of people, I've often said that sometimes we strive too much for perfection, whereas a lot of the time we don't need to be absolutely perfect. We need to get things where they're working and they're functioning, but not necessarily perfection. So I think that's an important message from the book as well, I think. And hopefully all of the tips around how to develop more flexibility and how to be more agile will also help people to kind of actually get more out of life and enjoy life more.
Okay, thank you, Elaine Fox, the author of SWITCHCRAFT. Thank you for joining our show, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it too. Nice talking to you.
Okay.